March 14, 1941. RAF Kinley Airfield. Pilots running, sirens screaming, and another Hurricane falling from the sky with a dead engine. It wasn't enemy fire. It wasn't sabotage. It was something far more humiliating for a nation depending on its fighter pilots to survive. Britain's greatest technological pride, the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, simply stopped working whenever a pilot pushed his aircraft into a negative G dive. If a Spitfire tried to follow a Bf-109 straight down, the fuel in the carburetor flooded. The engine choked. The pilot died. Every engineer blamed the same thing: carburetor limitations. Every officer said the redesign would take months of paperwork. But one engineer wasn't willing to wait. Her name was Beatrice Shilling, and she carried the solution in her pocket: a brass washer that cost less than 50 cents. Shilling wasn't a pilot. She didn't carry a weapon, but she understood physics better than anyone in the room. She studied the fuel pressure curves inside the Merlin. She calculated the runaway flow under negative G, and she knew that if she could restrict the movement of fuel during the dive, if she could choke the flood by just the right amount, the engine wouldn't stall. No redesign, no disassembly, no waiting. A 6mm hole in a brass disc installed into the fuel line. A washer, the kind any engineer could make in minutes. But British engineering bureaucracy didn't believe wars were won with washers, so Beatrice Shilling packed her tools, loaded her kit with hand-machined restrictors, and drove from base to base with a mission: install the fix before anyone could stop her. She arrived at Kinley and watched a pilot die in a dive because his command refused to approve a solution sitting in her hands. She wasn't going to accept another death. Without asking permission, she ordered a Hurricane into the hangar. She cut the fuel line open. A mechanic stared in disbelief. "You can't do that. We don't have orders," Shilling replied. "We don't have time for orders." The test flight took less than 10 minutes. The pilot dove hard, pulled negative G, fired his guns, climbed back out, and his engine kept running. For the first time in months, the Merlin didn't quit. Every pilot at the field gathered around the landing strip. They didn't see a brass washer. They saw survival. Commanders tried to stop her. They demanded forms, signatures, approvals. But pilots begged her to keep going. They volunteered their aircraft. They carried tools. They protected her work from political interference. And so, base by base, airfield by airfield, Shilling installed her washers throughout fighter command, quietly, illegally, fearlessly. And as the installation spread, German pilots noticed something terrifying. The Spitfires weren't breaking off the dive anymore. They were following. They were gaining. The Bf-109 advantage disappeared in a single week. By the end of March 1941, the RAF had a new superstition: if your fighter had the washer, you'd live. If it didn't, you'd pray. They called it Miss Shilling's Orifice. Crude? Yes. But to pilots, it was as sacred as armor. As the Battle of Britain raged, British fighters that once choked in dives now hunted the hunters. The Germans suspected a major redesign. They imagined new fuel systems, new engines, new aircraft. They never imagined the truth. A single woman, with a bag of handmade parts, had rewritten the rules of air combat. Official approval came late. Politics always arrives after heroes do the job. But by the time the Air Ministry recognized her modification, she had already saved 2,100 pilots. Men who would go on to fight in Malta, North Africa, Normandy, the skies over Berlin. A generation that lived to see victory because one engineer refused to accept the death of young men as an acceptable testing delay. Beatrice Shilling never asked for medals. She never demanded recognition. She simply fought the enemy no one else saw: bad engineering and bureaucratic fear. She died in 1990. But in every restored Spitfire, in every museum plate describing the Merlin engine, part of her legacy lives. And every time a pilot pushes a plane into a dive at full throttle, somewhere in the invisible machinery, her spirit whispers, "Don't you dare quit on me." Wars are not won by generals alone. Sometimes, they're won by a woman with a washer, who saved a nation before anyone believed she could.